Minister, thank you so much for joining Al Arabiya. I want to kick off by just asking you to set the scene for us in terms of the prospects for Saudi investment in the UK.
Yes, of course. My role as Minister for Investment is obviously to do everything that I can to sort of support investment in terms of the UK, but also UK into other nations, whether that's the Kingdom or otherwise. And I think at the moment it's a really exciting time to be thinking about the opportunity that the UK holds. For a start, we've got some of the best sort of academic institutions in the world, some really interesting problems that are being solved around there. Secondly, we're thinking about how we think about the sort of regulatory framework and making sure we have a good, open-minded, pragmatic and stable regulatory framework to support investors in helping driving our initiatives. But most importantly, we've really laid out what it is that the government's trying to accomplish within the UK, within our modern industrial strategy. And in there, we've laid out the sort of key areas that we are looking to sort of develop and drive into the future. What key one for me is thinking about sort of the green energy transition and how we use investment to sort of support our ambitions to be a green energy superpower by 2035.
What about artificial intelligence? Because obviously Saudi Arabia and the other Gulf countries are going to be spending billions on infrastructure. That's not something that the UK can do given your energy dynamic.
I am so interested in the artificial intelligence side. My background is from the technology sector, so obviously it's an issue that's close to my heart. And I think success around artificial intelligence is twofold. So the first thing is really thinking about the infrastructure, and that's accessibility to data centers, making sure we're provisioning the energy that's needed to keep all of that data safe and secure, the connectivity, making sure that the latency is appropriate, making sure you've got the skills and expertise to create all of that fantastic AI. But the other aspect is how do we encourage adoption of these technologies, and how do we create a culture of innovation where using technology in day-to-day aspects is part of what it is to engage with government. And one of the things that I found really interesting in this particular trip is the appetite within the Kingdom for people to use the technology on a day-to-day basis. And that's something that I've really paid attention to and thought, how do we encourage that kind of culture? And I think that's something that the government can really think about in terms of making the sort of technology-enabled services as well. So that's been a really interesting aspect in terms of it.
Covering the Kingdom, you see very often that they're ahead of the curve when it comes to adopting new technologies. And then, to your mind, how easily is that going to be done in the UK, given the fact that you have the highest energy costs, and at the same time, you have an infrastructure that doesn't necessarily enable that, plus regulation? Because the folks that I speak to on a regular basis say the UK is the last place that they want to open a business, and it's simply due to policies.
I categorically disagree, and I would say the counter. I think when you think about the regulation,
how can you disagree? All the millionaires left last year.
But let me touch on
and they're entrepreneurs, they don't want to do business in the UK.
This is my day-to-day life. I spend my day with these AI entrepreneurs and I see them, and I think about the regulatory framework. We have got, if you think about data privacy, so GDPR, I've got the strongest regulations that make sure we keep our consumers and data safe. But regulation around AI is incredibly pragmatic, which means innovators are able to come in, they're able to use the latest technology, but know that...
But I mean regulations on entrepreneurs specifically, and I'm talking about taxation.
Taxation.
Chasing them out of the country.
We have got the best research and development tax incentives anywhere in the world. The UK R&D tax incentive is world class. And I think that is one of the reasons that we've seen so much of that capability coming out of the UK. We have the best academic institutions in the world. We have got some world-class R&D tax incentives. With regards to entrepreneurs, we've got EIS schemes to make sure those early innovators are rewarded for the risk that they take. The next challenge I think that we're spending a lot of time thinking about is how do we make sure that they get access not just to the seed capital, which we know they do. There's many, many billion-pound companies coming out of the UK, but how do we provide them the scale-up capital to take that to the next level and beyond? And that's the part I'm really excited about.
So essentially, we saw the Baker building having your growth forecast for 2025. You're not doing well. What is the plan? Are you going to get Rachel Reeves fired? I mean, what is the next step for this government? Because we've heard a lot of announcements, but they haven't yet delivered.
All departments within the UK government are singularly focused on growth and how we accomplish those growth ambitions. No one is satisfied with the level of economic growth that we've seen over the last decade. And we acknowledge and know that the next decade will require us to make sure we are delivering on that growth. We have set ambitious targets. We've got the industrial strategy where we've been really thoughtful about what are those key sectors that are going to be driving growth. And then we thought about what is the role between that public and private partnership to be able to bring together investment to achieve that. So on the public side, we've got the National Wealth Fund, so thinking about how do we use public money to sort of seed and catalyse those sort of emerging markets, but then how do we work with the private sector to create investment opportunities so that we can coalesce and bring that investment around those key objectives that we've laid out in the industrial strategy.
You're here at a very historic time, the talks between the United States and Russia. There's a lot of concern in Europe that those folks aren't at the table. Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister, has said that we're going to have to spend a heck of a lot more on defense. Where is that money going to come from?
I think this is why this sort of key aspiration around growth is such an important situation. We had the budget that came out last year, and that raised a lot of money for the government to be able to invest in those key sectors, whether that's the healthcare or in terms of increasing defence spend or indeed education. But more is yet to be done, which is why sort of really helping to support the government on its growth agenda is my role as a Minister for Investment, and one I feel very passionate about.
So you coming from the private sector, you understand the need to show results. When are we going to see results from this government?
I also know that coming from the private sector, these things are very, very difficult to predict. But I think it's about how do we translate this overwhelming desire and will to see growth, and how do we translate that into execution? We're already starting to see that in terms of thinking about the regulation, making sure they're aligned with growth. But then it's also the pragmatic day-to-day frustrations that get in the way that the government is really trying to clear out. In my role as the Minister for Investment, people are talking about things like access to the grid. They're worried about sort of planning regulations and getting planning approvals through. And that's why the government has made sure that we are introducing more planners, clearing the way to allow that investment to come in rather than having to go through long, timely delays that not only cost you in terms of timescales, but also in terms of money, because that money is sat dormant, unable to sort of execute and unable to support the growth. So I think we're really helping to make sure that we clear away those barriers.
And finally, when you think about how you're going to invite investors into the UK, how do you deal with the pushback on the non-dom regulation? Because they say, why would I go?
I think it's not what I see. So every day within
That's
the
what I hear from many people I speak to, investors, people who used to live in the UK and who got out immediately when this legislation came in.
And I think understanding their reasons and the tax implications is something that the Chancellor is listening to, but ultimately innovation will be fostered by having the best academic institutions in the world, people out there solving those real problems, and then sourcing that investment behind that. I would love to see many, many, many more people that have generated that wealth coming into the UK and supporting that.
Minister, thank you for joining us.
It's been a real pleasure.